It's that gun you know from future weapons and Call of Duty, a technological marvel that garnered a ton of hype before being relegated exclusively to video games, the subgun of choice for cyberpunk enthusiasts and dudes who still think tribal tattoos are cool, the Kriss Vector. Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and today we have Krytac's new gas blowback rendition of this very distinctive gun. When I mentioned on Discord that we were looking to review this, a lot of people seemed surprised that we'd review such a modern gun. Look, we don't exclusively deal in retro, I'm just personally not a fan of modernizing old guns, and ooh, is that an obscure Cold War rifle? Seriously though, I do have a soft spot for cyberpunk guns, and more importantly, when we saw a gas submachine gun with an advertised 60 round capacity and readily available in the US, we knew this was something worth checking out. At SHOT Show 2007, Transformational Defense Industries, or TDI, unveiled the Kriss submachine gun concept, named after an Indonesian fighting dagger, and then subsequently renamed the company after the gun. The Vector was the first commercial implementation of a novel concept for a recoil system in which an inertial block moves vertically, reducing felt recoil by redirecting some of the recoil impulse downwards rather than backwards. It was brought to market as the Kriss Vector in 2008, seeing significant initial popularity but ultimately negligible military or law enforcement sales. Today, the Vector is primarily sold as a semi-automatic pistol-caliber carbine on the US civilian market, banking on the cult following it gained from its inclusion in popular films and video games. As we've said many times on this channel, interesting designs that don't quite work in real steel are perfect for Airsoft. This Krytac rendition is patterned off the second generation of Vector introduced in 2015, and specifically the 45 ACB chambering. Externally, this is the pretty common design of a plastic body wrapped around a metal frame. All the plastic is glass-reinforced nylon and feels solid, held together by steel HK-style crosspins. The small metal parts appear to be aluminum, like their real counterparts, rather than the usual zinc-heavy pot metal, and while the finish wears easily, they can actually be touched up with cold blue as needed. Starting from the muzzle, the small stub of an outer barrel ends in 14mm negative threading, which we have covered by a thread protector. This is not the thread protector that's supposed to come with the gun, as the vendor we ordered from omitted it in favor of an obnoxious orange flash hider, but any standard 14mm negative thread protector, muzzle device, or suppressor will fit. Immediately behind the barrel, there are threaded inserts for side rails. As a nice touch, the gun actually includes a side rail, though not both.
It's just the one rail, actually.
Admittedly, the left side rail is much less useful since it runs just under the charging handle, but if you want to master your own destiny and rub your knuckles on the M1913 cheese grater, another rail can be had for all of $25 from Kriss. Note that while the integral rails on the top and bottom of the Vector are plastic, the separate side rail it comes with is aluminum. The charging handle is non-reciprocating and folds up against the receiver. As mentioned before, this is also aluminum, and when pulled back it has about 45 degrees of travel on its own before it starts to cam the bolt back, and then at 90 degrees it reaches full extension. So there are 3 discrete stages to operating it. Handle comes back to 45, handle cams bolt to 90, and then it travels linearly the rest of the way. The cutout on the front makes it easy to grab, it's long enough to accommodate 2 fingers with room to spare, and it has a small protrusion to help keep from slipping off. Behind it, the bolt release has paddles for releasing the bolt and for manually locking it open, which can be comfortably done with one hand using the thumb. Underneath is the magazine release, which is plastic. It's surrounded by fencing for protection and has a fairly stiff spring, so it's difficult to accidentally release even when using the ribbed front of the gun as a foregrip, but being so high up makes it a little weird to hit while hanging onto the magazine, and shooters with smaller hands may not be able to reach it at all. While once again the use of nylon keeps the magwell rigid despite the relatively thin sidewalls, it also features cutouts to aid with extracting a stuck magazine, which, since this is Airsoft, we'll probably never have to actually use. On the opposite side, the ejection port is a plastic insert, which is held in place by 2 screws on the left side. The gun is covered in these hex head screws, which are what hold the various metal parts to the plastic shells. The cross pins are instead what's used for field stripping and routine disassembly, and all of these screws and pins are steel as they should be. The bolt is also visible and is an unremarkable flat black with a faux extractor molded in. Let's talk markings. The gun has Kriss twice on the receiver and once on the stock, and the Vector logo on either side of the lower receiver shell, on the underside of the pistol grip, and on the top of the stock. There's a recessed serial number on the left side, which is unique to each gun, and then in lieu of actual manufacturer's markings, we have Krytac official licensed product on the left and manufactured in Taiwan on the right. I want to point out that the reason they're recessed like this is because these markings are on the actual metal internal frame, not the plastic shell, because the frame is the serialized component under US law. Anyways, then the fire selectors marked semi, 2-round burst, and full auto, or maybe Morse code. while the safety is blank when in safe but reveals a big red bullet with a V in it when set to fire. I'm not sure we have enough branding on this gun. Is there anywhere else we can stuff our logo? I don't know, just shove it in the pictograms. That Dorito cost us $20,000 in design fees and we're getting every penny out of it. Well, these selector and safety levers are plastic, not a big deal, and click nicely between positions. These controls are ambidextrous, which is a little odd when the charging handle, bolt release, and mag release decidedly are not. The trigger is metal and is the pivoting style of the Gen 2 rather than the sliding design of the Gen 1. The pistol grip is ribbed on the front and back and textured on either side, and I find this gives a nice grip. I have fairly large hands, so it's also nice that there's more than enough room to accommodate gloves. However, when the gun is set to fire, choking up high on the grip causes the right side safety lever to dig into my hand a bit. Just something to be aware of. Inside the pistol grip is a storage compartment accessed by removing the protective cap, and out of the box this contains a hex key sized for the hop adjustment through the top rail. That's a nice little touch, and it even comes in a foam block to keep it from rattling around. And lastly, the stock is a very simple design, being a giant chunk of plastic with a hinge on one side of the gun and a locking latch on the other. It's secured with another simple takedown pin, so it's easy to remove if just folding it up isn't sufficient. In this folded position, it stays firmly in place, but unfolds by just pushing up to unlock and then pulling out. Once locked open, it does have a bit of side-to-side play, but this isn't noticeable in use. The stock has a sling attachment loop, though that is the only dedicated sling loop on the gun. It's also adjustable for length of pull by loosening 4 grub screws, but honestly, even as someone with long arms, I find tucking in the default length works just fine. One last thing on the stock, notice that the cheek rest is barely below the rail, so taller sights will be needed, which we'll discuss when we get to practicality. Oh yeah, the sights. This gun actually comes with irons styled after the Kriss plastic backup sights, which as a fun fact were originally developed in conjunction with Magpul. Unlike the Magpul backup sights, these don't lock in place, just flip up and down at will, with the front sight adjusting for elevation while the rear sight adjusts for windage and has both standard and CQB apertures. Frankly, it's 2024, and even for real steel I wouldn't go out of my way to get backup irons for a gun like this, but it's a nice inclusion and they weigh next to nothing, so might as well keep them on there. That's the gun, and the magazine is interesting too. This is dimensionally different from existing Glock magazines, both because it's a proprietary design and because it's a replica of a 45 ACP Glock mag rather than the far more common and Airsoft 9mm. It consists of a cast aluminum body with a plastic mock extension sleeve and is quite light at just 350 grams. As with most pistol mags, it has an exposed feed track, but the exposed portion ends about 2/3 of the way down the sleeve. This does mean that the feed track is visible when inserted in the gun, but at least the bottom portion is still covered from dirt and debris. On the back, there are mock witness holes, and you can make it look even more realistic by drilling them out. Warning, common side effects include vomiting, drowsiness, and a complete inability to hold gas. Overall, aside from the open front magazine and Airsoft manufacturer markings, we have a surprisingly accurate replica of a niche firearm, getting both the materials and appearance correct. It feels like a bit of a gimme to say that a mostly plastic Airsoft gun looks just like its mostly plastic real counterpart, but not all plastic looks or feels the same, and this does get it right. It's also heftier than you might expect from a plastic gun at 2360 grams, or 5 pounds 3 ounces. Externally, the only element that seems fragile is the stock, which is plastic and has a plastic hinge, but the real ones are like that too, so maybe I'm being unreasonable. I should also mention that while the Vector is composed of both an upper and lower receiver, there's no wobble or play between the halves. This is a solid gun. So to field strip, we'll start by taking those halves apart, first making sure that the hammer is cocked. There are 3 main body pins holding it together. With those removed, the entire upper now separates from the lower. Removing one last pin now frees the patented magical fantastical Space Age Super V recoil system, and well, we'll get back to that. With the recoil system removed, we can also pull out the bolt, taking care not to lose its rollers, which immediately fall off. That's the whole gun field stripped. It's actually pretty simple. Now we'll get into more complete disassembly, starting with the upper. First, removing 2 screws frees the ejection port. Next, I can take off the selectors and safeties. And now tapping out a small roll pin at the front of the rail allows it to slide off, exposing the screws that secure the trigger pack. I remove these, and the trigger pack slides out the front. This pack looks daunting and it's a bit of a pain to take apart, but how it works is actually pretty simple. Looking at it from the front, we have a set of sears that are all trying to catch the hammer, pushed down by springs retained above the pack. At the left, we have the in-battery safety or auto sear, then the semi-auto disconnector, the main sear, and the burst sear. The fire selector simply has cams to enable and disable certain sears, controlling which ones are actually active at any given time. So in semi-auto mode, the burst sear is disengaged, and the hammer only falls if first the auto sear is tripped, and then the main sear releases it. When the hammer is reset, the disconnector catches it, and when the trigger is released, the disconnector is cammed out of the way, and releases the hammer back onto the main sear. Simple enough. In full auto mode, the semi-auto disconnector and burst sear are both disengaged. Now the hammer falls when the main sear releases it, and the auto sear trips. Lastly, in 2-round burst mode, the semi-auto disconnector is disengaged, but the burst sear is finally active. This rides in a drum which has 3 pairs of grooves. In each pair, the second groove is deeper than the first. The hammer is released, it resets, the auto sear releases it again, it resets again, and now the burst sear drops into that deeper slot and catches the hammer. When the trigger is released, the burst sear is cammed out of the way, and it's ready to repeat the process. And then the burst drum is rotated by a small indexing pawl that pops out of the side of the hammer and is prevented from going backwards by the burst sear itself. Note that this is happening every time the hammer drops and resets, regardless of fire mode. All of this starts with the trigger, which is connected to the fire control group by a long transfer bar. Now that I've explained how this works, note that while the housing is some flavor of alloy, all the major fire control components are steel, they come well greased from the factory, and show negligible wear after about 7,000 rounds. The only part of this that might be a wear concern is the tiny pawl on the hammer that rotates the burst drum, but again, with it being steel, that might just as easily last forever. That's it for fire control, so now let's take the barrel out, which is actually shown in the manual. First, I fully unscrew the hop adjustment until it stops turning, then unscrew 2 screws in front of the hop unit. This allows the securing tab to slide out, and then the entire barrel assembly slides forwards, and then up and out of the gun. Quite easy, and if Krytac ends up selling spare barrel assemblies, it'll be straightforward to have a spare setup with a longer inner barrel and suppressor for outdoor use. Loosening 2 grub screws frees the barrel assembly, and then removing the retainer clip frees the barrel. The hop unit is cast using a spring-loaded tensioner arm with a concave shape similar to a Maple Leaf Omega nub. The barrel is brass, 120mm long, and note that it has a long groove for the retainer clip rib, so if you want to use an aftermarket barrel, you may need to remove that rib. The bucking and barrel are both standard GBB spec, and while it's hard to pick up on camera, the bucking has a simple flat mound for a contact patch. The hop adjustment is just a very long screw that is retained in position by a spring-loaded detent, and this pushes on the tensioner. This ensures consistent and even pressure, and the clicking detent system makes it easy to get back to the same position after reinstalling the barrel. Good system, but it is quite sensitive to small adjustments, which we'll see later. Now let's talk about the so-called Super V recoil system, which I've reassembled to demonstrate. In truth, this isn't as complicated as it's made out to be. We have a fairly ordinary bolt that reciprocates linearly in a track, moves back to pick up a round, moves forward to chamber and fire, but there's no conventional recoil spring. Instead, the recoil system is this assembly, which moves, well, it's not quite up and down, it's at a slight angle, but for the sake of simplicity we'll say up and down. And then it just has these cam rails which the bolt presses against. So the bolt is pushed back by recoil, which through the cam rails forces the recoil assembly down against the spring, and when it runs out of juice, the recoil assembly pops back up and forces the bolt forwards. It can't actually make the recoil impulse go away, it just has less mass moving forwards and backwards and adds some mass moving up and down, which gives it a weirdly bouncy feel. Really what makes the real Vector have low felt recoil is more that the inline placement of the bolt and barrel relative to the grip eliminates muzzle climb, and this cam surface imposes a varying mechanical disadvantage that makes this functionally a delayed blowback design, which in turn allows it to get away with less moving weight. Make some of that weight bounce vertically instead of moving laterally, and presto, there's your quote-unquote recoilless Vector. Okay, now you're probably wondering why is this nerd talking about how the real thing works, we're supposed to review an airsoft gun. And we are, because while the parts here don't look quite identical to their real counterparts, the way they function is exactly the same, and that has some interesting consequences. Before we get there, let's take apart the nozzle. So as I mentioned before, this bolt has 2 solid rollers that help align it in its track, along with 2 drums that are part of the casting, and this whole assembly weighs a mere 65 grams. Each drum contains a screw, which serves as a nozzle stop, and on reassembly these need to be tight to ensure they can't back out. I also need to remove an E-clip from the back of the bolt, and then the nozzle is free. The nozzle is simple, with one cross pin holding it together, and taking that out reveals the rocket valve and spring. This is a typical hollow rocket valve design, using a lug to keep it oriented to the nozzle and avoid unwanted rotation, and power can be reduced if needed by gluing an insert into the valve. The back of the nozzle, however, uses a piston cup seal. This isn't intrinsically all that weird, the idea is it expands under pressure to seal, but the problem is the rubber is so stiff and the surface area for pressurized gas to act on so small that in practice this nozzle does not seal adequately on propane anywhere below room temperature. As soon as cooldown sets in, the nozzle seal disappears, and so does the efficiency. That isn't helped by the BB stack in the magazine pressing upwards on the nozzle, which over time appears to scrape down the top of the nozzle where it contacts the carrier. At first, this allows the nozzle to angle upwards too far and compromises magazine seal, and eventually, for us occurring at about 2,000 rounds, causes the nozzle to stick forwards and fail to cycle. Since the damage was already done, we epoxied a shim to ours to hold the nozzle a little lower, but we would highly recommend instead sanding the inside corner very gently just to take off that sharp edge, and a smear of grease on the top of the nozzle wouldn't hurt. Since this alteration, we've done another 5,000 rounds without issue. And note that because this piston cup seal tends to squeeze out its lubricant when it seals, we found it is necessary to disassemble and lubricate this bolt more frequently than with other guns. Now let's look at the frame itself. The valve knocker is pretty well buried in there, and it incorporates a valve knocker lock which keeps the gas flowing even after the hammer resets until the bolt reaches a certain point. And when we look at the recoil assembly, which is two steel cam plates screwed into a plastic housing, we see that it mimics the irregular shape of the real Steel Vector's cams. That means that the bolt has to overcome more resistance at the start of travel than it does later. There's also a total of 105 grams of reciprocating mass here as well that the gun has to push. So when the gun fires, the bolt is pushing against significant mechanical disadvantage from the recoil system, plus the hammer spring, and then that valve knocker lock, all while bleeding out gas from the poor nozzle to carrier seal, and without having much mass to continue the cycle on inertia after the gas cuts off. To spoil the performance testing later, this makes for a system that is inefficient for how much mass it's actually pushing, and is not very good with full auto, cold weather, or weak gas. If the nozzle sealed better, this would work a lot better, and then we might even be able to remove the valve knocker lock to improve efficiency, but as it stands it needs as much gas as it can get because much of it is essentially getting thrown away. Anyways, note that the recoil system is short-stroked by a pair of rubber buffers. Originally these were identical, but we shortened the top one by about 3 mm to improve feed reliability. By default, the bolt doesn't have enough travel to pull the nozzle fully past the magazine, relying on momentum and a little bit of squish in the rubber to force the nozzle to collapse, and it often wouldn't chamber a BB when racked by hand. With this modification, the bolt can just barely go far enough to ensure consistent feeding. However, note that if the bolt can go too far, it will actually get stuck, so be careful with how much is removed and don't go beyond the minimum necessary. As a visual reference, the charging handle now stops about a millimeter short of fully retracted in its track. One other aspect that we modified was the cam surface on the recoil system. These two rails worked fine out of the box, but as they accumulated wear, they quickly showed an uneven cast surface with noticeable bumps and dips. The unevenness on the cam rails caused extra friction and ground the parts together, and this gradually reduced efficiency and caused the bolt to start having trouble returning to battery and failing to trip the auto sear. We sanded the rails smooth, and this returned the gun to optimal function, and we recommend doing this immediately out of the box before wear can accumulate. Even still, this gun will still require frequent cleaning and re-lubrication to minimize friction. That's all to talk about in the gun, so let's look at the magazine. This mag accepts around 24 grams of gas at room temperature and has a BB capacity of a whopping 60. It's difficult to load through the feed lips, but as the instructions show, you could just pull down the follower and squirt BBs into the feed channel. That does actually make it a little difficult to get them to stack perfectly for the full capacity, but it's possible to manually inject BBs in any gaps. That said, note you'll only get 58 or maybe 59 unless you use a tool to push the follower down further. I also want to mention that we have run into sporadic jams in the magazine, likely due to feed lip geometry, which occurs more frequently when the BBs are imperfectly stacked, but will still happen at random with certain mags, even with proper stacking. To take the mag apart, we first need to remove the base plate. This can be done by pulling up the feed spring so that the end piece is pulled off the base plate, which can then rotate 90 degrees and come off, freeing the spring and follower. This extension is actually just a plastic sleeve retained by two tabs at the bottom, and removing it requires pulling it up the mag while carefully prying out the plastic on either side of the tab. Two things here. First, one of our 4 magazines was actually missing the spring end piece altogether. Second, this magazine came with the feed channel drenched in oil, so much you can see some still remains, and oil getting on the BB spoiled the hop until it was cleaned out. Well, with the sleeve removed, the baseplate pins are exposed, which I can punch out, with some effort.
3 hours later.
And then I can remove the base plate. The base plate uses a fitted gasket, always better than O-rings for this purpose. And then the reservoir is one big empty void. The valves are similarly nondescript, though note that these are virtually identical to VFC fill and output valves. We don't believe this gun is actually VFC OEM like some suspected, and certain elements of the gun don't match how VFC usually does things, but the resemblance here is unmistakable. And lastly, the gas router is a static design that does not protrude very far above the magazine. It can't compress much, so it's difficult for it to get a good seal without applying enough force to bind up the nozzle, but it seems to seal sufficiently nonetheless. Despite my criticisms, I actually think there's a solid system here made with good materials. The fire control group is full steel, the hop unit is well designed, the mags have excellent capacity in both gas and BBs, and it's pretty easy and stress-free to take apart and put back together. However, the recoil buffers are just a little too long, the bolt scrapes the nozzle, and the cam rails are rough, and while all three of these can be fixed at home without much effort, the latter two will cause significant problems if not addressed. Again, after addressing them about 2,000 rounds in, we've done about 5,000 more rounds without further problems. The only remaining issues we've run into are the poor nozzle seal and the intermittent stoppages in feeding, neither of which can be remedied with an at-home fix. And lastly, we've seen multiple reports online of the valve knocker springs breaking, but we're still unclear on exactly what causes this or how widespread it is. On to controls and operation. Magazines are straight insert, and then if the buffer system has been modified as we showed, pulling the charging handle loads the first round. The safety clicks down to fire, independently of the fire selection. The trigger is surprisingly nice for how much it's doing under the hood. There's a very light take-up, then a tiny bit of creep across the brake, but it's a short 4-pound pull with an equally short reset distance. When the magazine is empty, the bolt locks back and can be dropped by pressing the front of the paddle release. It can also be manually locked open by holding the rear paddle while pulling the charging handle. Let's go shoot it. This gun has recoil, in the same way that LaCroix has flavor. Still, we should take a moment to appreciate that Krytac did what Kriss couldn't, and made an actually recoilless submachine gun. Golf clap, please. Okay, now that I've gotten the jokes out of my system, I will say that it is an excellently snappy cycle with a sharp report, which combined with the tactile brake of the trigger, provides the feedback that it doesn't get on recoil alone. This is less like shooting a conventional gas rifle and more like shooting a tuned aluminum slide pistol, and I imagine some people will be very pleased with this experience, while some will see it as a little better than an HPA engine. In terms of efficiency, we get 100 to 120 shots on continuous slow semi-auto at 68 Fahrenheit before it stops locking back. In terms of raw performance, that's okay, but it's not a lot for how much gas the mags have and how little the recoiling parts weigh. In strings of 60 with time to warm up between, it manages 2 full mags, then stops feeding halfway through a third. Next we test full auto. And it struggles to make it through even a single mag before failing to feed. That's weird, because in prior testing, we were able to clear a mag when firing in bursts. And if the mag's at all cold, it barely shoots at all before it starts short stroking. And with the magazine chilled to freezing, it doesn't even cycle. But in fast semi or 2-round bursts, we can zip through a full mag without problems. Unless the mag decides to stop feeding, or it's been overfilled, which rapidly cools it to where it won't feed, or if the lubrication is gummed up or blown out, causing nozzle malfunctions. Normally we don't see such inconsistency in behavior, so what's going on here? Well, first, the stiff cup seal and high spring resistance mean the gun does not function well at low input pressure, and a tendency for the mags to siphon liquid when cold causes them to cool down quickly in full auto or if the mag is overfilled. As long as the magazines are warm and pressure is high, it can seal up well enough and quickly enough to complete the cycle, but once the mags start to get cold, it leaks like a sieve. Throw in that it has relatively little moving mass, so it can't rely on inertia to complete the cycle, and you get a gun that works fine as long as everything is warm, but as soon as it starts to cool down, it rapidly becomes unable to fully cycle or lock back, and any excess friction immediately causes problems. And then as the gun itself gets cold, lubricant becomes less effective, and a cold bolt will chill gas as it enters the nozzle, causing cooldown effects even on a fresh mag, which is exactly what we saw with the full auto test. It's not that the gun doesn't work, it's just extremely sensitive to adverse conditions. When used with both the mag and gun at room temperature, with proper lubrication, in fast semi-auto, it experiences no significant cooldown and has no trouble getting through 2 mags. Unless the mag decides to stop feeding. We suspect the Vector will never be as efficient as a conventional rifle, but there is substantial room for improvement here, starting with a better nozzle seal. For now, this gun will need to stick to semi- or 2-round bursts in warm weather or indoor arenas and with regular maintenance, plus stronger gas will help too. All that said, we're told CO2 mags are coming, and that might actually be worthwhile here. I bet it's going to chew through capsules like nobody's business, but the internals do seem durable enough to handle it. On the chrono, it starts at 1.1 joules with 0.32 gram BBs, but settles to below 1 joule after about 10 or so shots. This could present an issue for fields with a hard limit of 1 joule, but fortunately the rocket valve is easy to access and adjust as shown earlier. As a quick addendum, with a 210mm 605 inner barrel, it starts at 1.4 joules and settles down to around 1.3 joules. This doesn't protrude very far out of the outer barrel and is easily concealed by a suppressor, so using a longer inner barrel to bump up the power for outdoor play is definitely viable. For the rest of the video though, we'll be using the stock barrel setup. And then at 100 feet, the consistency of the stock bucking is okay, but it throws occasional hooks and flyers. You may notice the BBs are usually dropping, and that's a consequence of the hop adjustment system. While it does click in very nice increments, 1 click is the difference between .32s dropping a bit at this distance or going to the moon. A 10-round grouping at 20 yards measures 3.75 inches horizontally and 2.75 inches vertically, which is a pretty great grouping for a stock gun, but doesn't quite convey that inconsistency in the hop. For a CQB environment this will work fine, but for longer range you might want to experiment with alternative buckings. For practicality, well, the Vector's a weird gun. At around 2750 grams, or a bit over 6 pounds loaded, it's not heavy, and at 600mm or 2 feet long, it's fairly compact, but it is distinctly front-heavy, with much of the weight resting on the offhand. The unconventional layout also puts the bore axis very low relative to the sight line, with the irons giving a comparable sight height to AR irons, but over an inch higher relative to the bore. That means more parallax in the trajectory, and more of the shooter needing to be exposed over the top of cover. And if you want a modern heads-up posture, you will need tall sights or risers, because as mentioned before, this is fairly AR-like in terms of sight height. The EOTech is a classic look, but as it is designed for absolute co-witness, I wanted something just a little bit taller. A microdot on a lower third co-witness riser is cheap, light, and works well. The length of pull is also relatively short by default. As mentioned, this can be extended, but not by a lot, and I find that with a lengthened stock, a squared stance puts the corner of the stock directly into my cheek. This isn't a gun I'd want to shoot bladed, so keeping it shorter works better for me. The integral grip surface is also a little weird. I actually find this pretty comfortable, but my natural inclination is to grip high, and that puts my palm over the bolt release and prevents the gun from locking open. Lower still covers the magazine release, but with the fencing this isn't an issue, and just squeezing it won't drop the mag. Of course, with the rail surface, a foregrip is common, and Kriss actually makes one specific to the Vector, incorporating a hand stop, removable side panels for a tape switch, and a storage compartment. It also doesn't project below the magwell, which is a nice touch. Even then, I prefer to put my thumb up on the charging handle, which also makes it easier to release magazines. Speaking of which, the mag release is definitely strange. Releasing a mag is easy, but releasing a mag while retaining it in the offhand requires big hands and a bit of a stretch. Otherwise, if you let mags drop, then this is straightforward, with both mag release and bolt release handled by the left-hand thumb. If shooting left-handed, this all becomes significantly more difficult, but is still doable. The safety being a simple ambidextrous thumb lever is easy to actuate with either hand, so really it's just the mag changes that will take some practice. The mags themselves are enormous, longer than extended 9mm Glock magazines or conventional 9mm submachine gun magazines, and this is really going to limit suitable load-bearing equipment. I would not trust them to stay in an open-top pistol bag pouch, so something submachine gun specific will be needed, but fortunately with their high capacity, a decent combat load only requires a couple of mags. A triple subgun mag pouch plus one in the gun gives you 240 rounds on tap, more than a standard 6+1 rifle mag combat load. So, upgrades and aftermarket. Unlike most new guns we review, there already exists a substantial suite of aftermarket, as Krytac has confirmed that external parts intended for the AEG Vector will fit. That said, amidst the sea of unnecessary but aesthetically varied rail systems, replacement controls, and maybe actually worthwhile stock swaps, there's one part that I think is definitely worth looking into, and that's the Lilacs extended magazine release. A bit pricey, but an AR-like mag release system would make right-handed reloads much less awkward. Lastly, there's also a bunch of companies champing at the bit to release HPA adapters, and while that may be a way to brute force through the efficiency problems, it's still going to suck down a ton of air and, well, look incredibly ugly as it does it. Oh, and I don't know if you guys have picked up on it, but I'd really like to see aftermarket manufacturers make a better nozzle seal. Maybe an O-ring. Pretty please. And a pony while we're at it. Oh, and one more late addition is Comrade Quiche's speed loader adapter. For full disclosure, we were given this product for free, but I think the results speak for themselves. Easy to use, no problem filling to capacity, highly recommended. Alright, let's summarize pros and cons. Externally, the use of glass-reinforced nylon and aluminum makes this look accurate to its real counterpart and just nicely realistic in its own way, and it feels as solid as it should. Internally, it has steel where it counts and is easy to work on, but it has various minor issues that will need to be fixed and feed unreliability and poor nozzle seal that are not fixable at present. The magazines have fantastic BB capacity and hold a lot of gas to boot, but the current poor efficiency of the gun means that gas doesn't go nearly as far as you might expect, and it is basically non-viable in full auto or cold weather. There's no recoil to speak of, but the crisp trigger break, sharp report, and quick cycle provide good feedback. The hop performs just okay out of the box, and the course adjustment makes it hard to dial in, but it is easy to adjust with the included key and easy to work on in standard spec, so swapping for better bucking is viable. And ergonomically, well, it's weird and ungainly, but I can't fault the replica for that. So is it worth it? Well, for US players at least, $500 ship for the gun plus a full combat load of mags is cheap by gas gun standards, but there are much less temperamental options for CQB submachine guns at this price point, albeit none that can match the Vector for raw capacity. If you like gas guns for recoil, then the Vector is never going to be the gun for you, but if you really like the Vector design, then the Krytac can be made to work, and it sure beats paying scalpers prices for a KWA. Krytac has demonstrated an interest in hearing user feedback and improving their product, so it'll be interesting to see what they do, and despite the problems, we really do think this gun is salvageable. In fact, if the issues are ironed out, this will be not only a good gun, but also one that will be ideal for players new to gas blowback. But right now, it's too sensitive to operating conditions, too maintenance intensive, and too reliant on DIY fixes for us to recommend it without major caveats. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on what both Krytac and Aftermarket come up with, but for now, that's all for today. If you'd like to support our channel, please consider visiting our merch store linked in the description, and as always, thank you for watching. There's a lot of cool new stuff coming out this year, and we're looking forward to sharing it with you.